Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Care Connection, the free live webinar. Today we have a very special guest speaker. Her name is Dr. Gail Dahl. Before we begin, I would like to let everyone know that on the right-hand side you have a control panel. That is where you could type in your questions and comments, as this presentation will be in listen-only mode. In addition, the PDF version of today's presentation, the PowerPoint, will be on the right-hand side, again, on the control panel under Handouts. Our speaker again today is Dr. Gail Dahl, and she became the director of the Center on Aging in 2005. In her years working at the Center on Aging, she has taught many courses, both at the undergraduate and graduate levels, winning several teaching awards. For more than a dozen years, she's been the lead or co-lead investigator for the Promoting Excellent Alternatives in Kansas Nursing Homes, known as PEAK program. In research, she studies person-centered care in nursing homes and sexuality in long-term care. She's written a book for nursing home training entitled Sexuality in Long-Term Care, Understanding and Supporting the Needs of Older Adults. Now, we're so happy to have you. Please begin today's presentation.
Well, hello, everybody. I'm happy to be with you today talking about a topic that is near and dear to my heart. I am going to be talking mostly about this in the context of nursing homes, but of course, most of the content here is applicable to many different settings. I also want to be sure that I state right off the bat that I have, like many of us do, an implicit bias for heterosexuality. And so sometimes that can become apparent in the way I talk about this. Most of this content, however, can apply to LGBTQ and other types of situations. So I just wanted to make it clear that while I don't explicitly talk about LGBTQ issues throughout this presentation, they can apply. So here we go, talking about sexuality and long-term care. I have enjoyed a happy situation in my life where I have been able to work with almost all of the nursing homes in Kansas with the PEAK program. And initially when we started, we wanted to just teach about person-centered care, and we were developing modules for nursing homes so that they could learn how to apply those principles. As we developed them, we came up with spirituality, dining practices. We talked about culture change. We talked about measuring culture change. We probably had 10 different modules created until one day one of my staff members said, we haven't done one on diversity. So I said, why don't you go ahead and initiate that? She did. And when I read it, I saw that she'd included a section on LGBTQ. And it dawned on me that we really hadn't talked about sexuality at all, nor do most of our nursing homes broach that issue either. So that led us to create another module on sexuality. We started testing it around as a training among nursing homes in Kansas and had remarkable results. And so that led to the book that I wrote and led to lots of other presentations, and I've got many, many stories to tell. I'd like to share them with you as I go through this presentation. So these are the learning objectives. For today, we're going to be defining sexuality and its manifestations. It's surprising how frequently when people hear the word sexuality, they immediately think about sex and sexual intercourse. Sexuality is much, much broader than that. We're going to talk about that a little bit. Understanding the positive effects of sexuality for residents, that in itself, had you said that statement to nursing home staff about 20 years ago, they would have laughed at you. But now we're finding many, many more nursing home staff being much more enlightened to the positive benefits of sexuality. There's been a change in attitudes to improve outcomes for sexuality-related incidents in nursing homes. Previously, most regulators would have almost always found any type of sexuality in nursing homes as problematic, but we're becoming much more broad-minded about that. Also understanding how dementia affects consent in nursing homes. This is probably where the bulk of this presentation will be on today. We are finding the best and the hardest stories to be associated with people who have dementia. We'll also be talking just briefly at the end about resident-on-resident aggression, something that we're seeing more of in nursing homes right now. We don't know what it is about the population of nursing home residents that may be leading to this. And if you have any speculations about that, I'd love to see that in the comment section at some point during this presentation. So this is the most important concept I'm going to give you today. So the social construction of age is so important. It's something that we teach our students about all the time. So we end up being what people think we are. And so if people think that over the age of 65, all older people are asexual, that's what we tend to believe about ourselves. So there are many different constructions of self. We have chronological age, which is something that we have associated with being old for a very, very long time. So that when one turns 65, they automatically become old. And we all know that probably age is the only time that it becomes important is when you can get your first alcohol without using a fake ID. But we also look at age from a biological perspective, so that definitely affects how people think about sexuality, mostly because of changes in appearance or changes in the ability to have sexual intercourse. Then there's the psychological side of age. You're who you believe yourself to be. So if somebody asks you how old you are and you say, hey, I feel like I'm about 35, and in essence, you are already 70, you probably are psychologically younger than many of your peers. But the one that is probably the most damaging is the social construction of self. And that's when people tell us what we should be, and the culture around us shapes how we believe about what we feel about sex and sexual intimacy. So part of this is because many people view aging as a series of losses. So here's a list of losses related to sexuality. You lose your intimate partner, you lose your libido, there's physical attraction loss, and of course, biological function can change over time. When we expect these losses, we may buy into a belief that older adults don't want sexual intimacy. This belief is held across generations. Younger people don't think that older people have an interest, but older people don't recognize the need for intimacy either. They may even think that if they have these needs, they are abnormal. So it wasn't so long ago that older women were told that men were the ones to have sex and enjoy it, and women were to give it as a gift. So what we want to do is normalize sexuality. It might be good to note here that older people were sometimes socialized to think about sexuality very, very differently than younger individuals. Sexual intercourse was generally believed as for men, and that women wouldn't like it. I've had a group of friends that were older than me that called themselves the Tuesday ladies for years and years. It was because on Tuesdays, they would find different spots in Kansas to go and visit. And in later years, they discovered that if they would go to the local bars, the farmers would buy them drinks. And so they became the Tuesday ladies, and I interviewed them many times over the years. In later years, as I got involved in sexuality, I asked them the question about what they knew about sex before they got married. And most of them said absolutely nothing. It was a big shock or a big surprise to me. But one of the women said that her boyfriend had actually had sex with a neighbor girl, and she asked him about it, and he said to her, "Oh, don't worry, it'll be over in 5 minutes." So obviously he bought into the notion that it wasn't going to be fun for her. That's what that generation believed. And of course, generations since then have had very different viewpoints of it. I also have an older friend who just turned 99 about 2 weeks ago, and she keeps telling me that she doesn't understand why I'm so interested in sexuality and aging. And she says it's not an issue for older people. But on the other hand, she read all of the Shades of Grey books, and she loves The Bachelor, and she has designs on a man who's 35 years her junior. I believe that older people, women in particular, particular condition themselves to not be interested in sex, mostly because they believe it's unavailable to them. So when I have this conversation with older adults, I usually call it an intimacy presentation because it's an easier word to hear than sexuality. Intimacy is a need for a close relationship, sharing secrets, feelings, etc. Familiarity, closeness, affection, warmth. These are all things related to intimacy. And we know that it's very, very important for older adults to have these types of relationships, that there's a failure to thrive in older adults similar to a failure to thrive in infants that are not held or touched. So sexuality is the quality or state of being sexual. It's a part of our personality. It's what we're born with. It's what we carry throughout our lives. There's not been a whole lot of research on sexuality. The earliest research was done by Kinsey. If you know anything about his research, it wasn't really related to older adults because the cutoff was 50 or 55, and most of that research was done in gay bars. So it really couldn't be generalized to other populations. Only recently, within the last 10 or 15 years, have there been large-scale studies of sexuality in older adults. And what we've learned from them is that the majority of older people still have sexual desires, and if they can find a partner, they are likely to have a sexual or intimate relationship. Much of the research, we have very, very little research related to the sexual relationships that people with dementia have. As you might imagine, it's very difficult to have this kind of research. You can't really do survey research, and it's very difficult to also try to do qualitative research through interviews. So we don't have a lot of information about dementia and sexual activity. But I'm going to share some of those things with you as we progress. So sexual expression is the way we prefer to talk about sexuality and the activities that come from it, particularly when we talk about nursing homes. It's important to note that people in nursing homes rarely have intercourse, but that does not negate the need for intimate relationships and touch. We are beginning to see some studies about failure to thrive, as I said earlier, and some of it correlates with loneliness and isolation. When you see it, even before it comes to this level, it can be really sad. I have a class that meets at a continuing care retirement home close by, and I remember a couple of times I'm a touchy-feely person. I went up behind one of the older mentors that we had for our students and touched him on the shoulder, and he turned around and he said to me, "Oh, thank you so much. Nobody has touched me since my wife died 9 months ago." So there's a real need for touching and for different types of intimate behaviors that aren't sexual in nature. Also, a group of widows, the same women that I told you about earlier, once they were in their 80s, they had begun to lose many of their husbands, and I asked them if they missed physical touch or those relationships, and first they said no because they had each other, and then they said, "But we manufacture ways to get hugs. It's so important for us to be touched." But it's also important to recognize that not all people are interested in an intimate relationship. When asked to rate her sex life from 1 to 10, an older woman declared, "I haven't had sex since 1979, and I haven't missed it a bit, so I'd give my sex life a 10. Just shows you that there's quite a bit of variety there. So when we talk about the positive effects of sexuality, we know there's some very strong biological things. An increase in dopamine, oxytocin, and testosterone means you feel good and you have more energy. Behavior, you get actual exercise from thinking about intimate relationships, having intimate relationships, those kind of things. Emotion, people who have been able to express their sexuality report that they have positive feelings, they're less depressed, they have greater life satisfaction. On an interpersonal level, we see a decrease of loneliness and isolation and the development of close social relationships. At a spiritual level, there's gratitude, generosity, and ability to communicate love. So it creates this deep sense of connection that we all seem to crave. So what's wrong with this picture? What we know is we have a cultural bias regarding older adult sexuality. These ageist beliefs can bias staff and regulators, family members, and our peers. Peers can be just as stigmatizing as junior high kids. When you go to CCRC and you see a new relationship that develops, you might be able to see people who reside there as bullying or making snide comments or embarrassing the couple who has a relationship. So just a plug here for Peak 2.0. It's a program that we've created here in Kansas, and it's a pay for performance, meaning that the state pays nursing homes more the better they provide this care. And so it's person-centered care. We understand bathing, wake and sleep patterns, meaningful activities, but until recently, we really didn't see sexuality as a part of this person-centered care. I recommend that you look for the Peak 2.0 on our website, and so that you can learn more about it, because it fits really, really well with this discussion. So the importance of staff training. As I mentioned, we created this module and we took it to several nursing homes. The training itself was only about 50 minutes long, and during that training, we were able to get staff members to begin having perhaps more open minds about thinking about sexuality and aging. We went back 9 months later and we found all kinds of changes that had been made. People were putting do not disturb signs on doorways. They were knocking and waiting for a response before they entered doors, so they were trying to offer more privacy. They were pushing beds together, sometimes putting mattresses on the floor and helping residents to get down and up. They had one couple who was celebrating an anniversary. They actually got a hotel room for them. So we were seeing all kinds of accommodations, and they were requesting for more information because it had enlightened them so much. So what we found is that it's really an easy thing to get people to change their mind with. And this is one of the ways we've done it. This is a video that we don't have time to show today, but I wanted to keep it in the slides so that you would see this address. It's only 5 minutes long. It is a really well done cartoon about people expressing their need for sexuality. And what it does is humanizing older adults' needs in a way that's comfortable and not embarrassing for people. So as it's done in cartoon form, you can relax into it. There's some funny pieces to it. And at the end, you actually see the real people behind the voices. And it's the first thing we do when we do training. And it really, really does make people begin to see sexuality in a whole different light. I encourage you to try to find this. It only takes 5 minutes. So sometimes sexuality spells trouble. And this is it happens particularly in nursing homes. Unfortunately, it's almost always the male partners or the men in residence at nursing homes that get into trouble. And as we'll see later, even if a woman is the initiator, it's quite frequently the man is seen as the dirty old man. So what goes wrong? Inappropriate behaviors we're going to cover a little bit more later on. Dementia can lead to lots of problems related to sexuality. And again, we'll cover that soon. Disgruntled family members, these are people who remember their mom as being a totally different person. And when she has dementia, she may have some behaviors that they find embarrassing or, quite frankly, related to somebody that they don't know. And that can be the hardest part of dealing with dementia when it becomes institutionalized. Uninformed staff members, obviously we believe that every nursing home should have policies and training related to sexuality, but it's just not happening. And we also know that certified nurse aides and other nurses, people who work in nursing homes, enter nursing homes with the same beliefs and bias that many of the society have, that older adults are asexual and this wouldn't happen. So without that education, it's very, very difficult for people to approach sexuality in an informed manner. Also jealous residents, which I had mentioned earlier. So here's some of the inappropriate behaviors that we've seen. Disrobing or masturbating in public. And it's interesting to note how we've changed how we approach or deal with this particular type of behavior. More recently, in the past, it used to be that we would tie somebody's hands down to avoid something like this, put their clothes on backwards. But what we know now is those are forms of restraints, and certainly not something that we would want to do. Sometimes we see fondling, unwanted advances. These could be verbal, like a resident who propositions staff or other residents, or sometimes it's physical. We also see in nursing homes in particular the asking for a genital care that's probably not needed as a form of unneeded or inappropriate behavior surrounding sexuality. So we see lots of reasons, and of course, if you can identify the reasons for this, then you can perhaps identify some interventions that might reduce the number of inappropriate behaviors. So quite frequently, we see boredom. So one of my staff members here is a former nursing home employee, and she ran a dementia care unit. And what they did in their nursing home was when you applied to get in, you filled out a daily pleasure list of things that you like to do at home that you wanted to continue doing. And this particular gentleman wrote on his list that he wanted to have a prostitute. Well, they had to talk to him, and they said, well, prostitutes just aren't legal in our state, so you can't have a prostitute. And they said, what would you like to have that would be legal and that would be a good substitute for this? And he said, I want some pornography. And since pornography is not illegal here, the staff sat down and they decided to create a plan where they would purchase items that he was asking for. And they had to decide who would do that, because you really don't want to have forced staff members who feel uncomfortable with that to do those kind of things. But then they also made a care plan that said, this man obviously may have some unmet needs that we might need in other ways. So they made sure that they talked to him every time they walked by him, laid a hand on his shoulder, made sure that he had something to do so he wasn't bored. And what they found was he seldom needed to use his pornography products, and that life with him became much more comfortable because he had some unmet needs that didn't have to be used in inappropriate manners. So your diagnosis or the disease that you have might lead to inappropriate behaviors. We do know that there are some forms of dementia that are more associated with inappropriate behaviors, with increased libido and increased sexuality. Not typically with Alzheimer's disease. We usually see a decrease in sexual desire with people who have Alzheimer's. With Parkinson's, however, there can be an increase in libido. Medications can affect this. Sometimes people, if they have dementia, medication might increase their desire for sexuality and sexual expression. Mental health issues, obviously, and dementia. So dementia can cause persons who may have had sex just briefly before to forget that they'd had it and request it again. So that's something to take into consideration. Might talk here, I wanted to mention that while these are things that happen in nursing homes, we do see some patterns in couples, married couples or long-time relationships, when one of the members has dementia. And what we see most frequently is that their behaviors can stay the same. So in regards to sexuality, they might, if they were frequent, if they frequently had intercourse, they might continue that, because that's one way of achieving mastery for the person with dementia, and it's one way of maintaining their relationship. We might also see that sexuality or sexual expression decreases. Much of this is because one of the partners typically takes on a paternal or maternal attitude, taking care of the partner, and it no longer feels like you're married to the same person you had been. Sometimes we see an increase in affection with a decrease of sexual intercourse. This is typical when we see one of the partners who has dementia then is institutionalized, and you'll see that his partner or her partner becomes much more affectionate, maybe because of the guilt of institutionalizing the partner, or maybe because she's been relieved of the stress of taking care of him. So we can see lots of different patterns related to sexuality. One of the more interesting ones is that maybe the partner who has dementia never was an initiator before and now has become one. And what we see in that relationship is that typically women don't like to see their husband initiate any more than they had before, but it's a delight for men whose wives were never initiators to suddenly realize that now that she has dementia, she seems to be wanting that more in their relationship. And so they seem to really get a kick out of that and enjoy it. So let's talk just briefly about dementia and consent. So this is probably the most problematic issue that we have in nursing homes. It's when we mix sexuality and dementia. Because it's so difficult, the default is not to allow any of these relationships for persons with dementia, and that way the home can be avoiding trouble with regulators and with states. But we do know, we've recently had a couple of stories related to this, both of them actually in Iowa. On the first one, I was asked to be an expert witness in this particular case. It didn't go to trial, and the director of nursing and the administrator lost their licensure because of it. But the second case was very interesting, and you may have heard about it. It involved Henry Rahans, who was a state legislator living in Iowa. In his 70s, he married a widow. He himself was widowed, and they got married and had a very loving relationship. They were openly affectionate in public. He would take her to the state house with him. They enjoyed a very happy relationship until several years into the marriage, her forgetfulness turned into a deeper stage of dementia. And it was at this point that her daughters convinced Henry that he needed to put her in a nursing home. Once she got into the nursing home, the daughters, these are the wives' daughters, convinced a doctor to put into the care plan that Henry and his wife were not to have sex while she was in the nursing home. And at a care plan meeting, Henry agreed to this particular care plan. And then soon after that, she was moved into a semi-private room, you know, the kind of rooms that have a curtain between them. And her roommate reported to the administrator of the nursing home that she had heard sex noises coming through the curtain. Well, because it was seen as a rape, because it was in the institution, Henry was picked up and charged with rape. In Iowa, you can have sex with your wife at home if she has dementia, but once she becomes institutionalized, then it becomes rape. He was accused of rape. He admitted initially that he had had sex with her. There was actually some video evidence that would lead people to believe that that had happened. And then later retracted and said that he was repositioning her in the bed and that they had actually been praying the rosary. Well, he didn't want it to settle outside of court. He went to court so he could be exonerated, and it made the national news. This is a picture from the New York Times article that was written about him. And the New York Times has an online version that permits comments. And we were intrigued by those comments because there were nearly 2,000 of them. And the New York Times, right after that, wrote a second article saying that that was more comments than they've ever had from any other story. So in our office, we analyze those comments to see what America is thinking about particular incidents like this. New York Times readership is probably a bit more liberal, but we were finding that many people were disturbed that as a married couple, you could be charged with this kind of injustice, particularly since his wife seemed to appear to really appreciate the intimacy that they shared, and in fact, it seemed to improve her quality of life. The most interesting thing that happened from this was many people were saying that they would create a durable power of attorney for sexuality before they had dementia so that they could actually have sex in a nursing home without their partner being charged for something like this. Of course, that creates a lot of different problems. A durable power or an advance directive means that you're creating something while you're non-demented or you're cognitively intact that may change, your feelings may change dramatically once you have dementia or Alzheimer's disease. And so I'm suggesting that you may talk to somebody who is in charge of your durable power of attorney for healthcare and say, this is the way I believe, but check in with me when I have dementia and you be my voice if I need that particular thing. So we have had a lot of mileage off of this, talked to a lot of people and had lots of discussions related to this. And the next part of this particular webinar will be related to those things. So, ethical rights. In America, anyone over the age of 16 to 18 years is assumed to have the capacity to consent unless proved otherwise. They also have the right to not have unconsented sexual aggression directed toward them and the right to have capacity to consent evaluated. So in the particular story about Henry, his wife was no longer able to tell people, yes, that she was consenting to sexuality. And we have been saying that it is possible to tell by a person's actions and behaviors whether they're consenting. But then the natural outcome from that is to hear from people who say, yes, but that's what they've said about teen rape for years, is that men or perpetrators get away with raping because they said, oh, but your eyes said yes, yes. And so naturally, there is a lot of concern over this issue. How will we determine whether people have the capacity to make these decisions? And if they can't make these decisions, does that mean that they're doomed to never have sexual expression be a part or intimacy be a part of their lives again? In this case, capacity for decision making is used as a clinical term, and competency is a legal term and more global, covering a wide range of decisions and activities. Capacity, however, may be determined separately, as in a person might have the capacity to form intimate relationships, but may not have the capacity or the ability to keep their own checkbook. One of the articles I read once and I really appreciated was, it would seem like the capacity to decide if you wanted to have an intimate relationship would be similar to the capacity to choose to have an ice cream cone than the capacity to make greater decisions about financial situations. So, neither advanced age nor the presence of cognitive impairment in themselves are sufficient to declare incapacity to decide or to consent. As you can see, this is pretty subjective, and therefore it's really hard to agree on. But this might be some way of that we can begin to think about that. So these are tests that are used for determining capacity. On the left-hand side, you see the subjective factors. These are the ones that are harder to measure. The person's values, the risk of harm to the person if they have a particular relationship, and the possible interventions that may enhance this particular capacity, such as education about sexuality, condom usage, and those kind of things. And in this case, the values, we have to determine, are these the values of the person with dementia attempting to have a relationship? Are these the values of staff or family members? So I would suggest that we try to look at the values of the person who wants to have the relationship. On the other side are the standardized measures, and you're probably familiar with many of those. They're the functional diagnoses, cognitive underpinnings, psychiatric or emotional factors. And there are a number of pen and paper assessments or interview assessments that aid in making this determination. So the criteria for sexual consent varies between states. Some states are slightly more liberal than others, but this one is from Kansas. And these values are pretty broad. You might see from your states particular documentation that they are much more specific. But knowledge and understanding or reasoning and voluntariness need to be considered when you're looking at capacity. And I have another case study in this case. This was from an article that was written by my colleague, Maggie Syme. And I'm going to fill in some of the details, but not read the entire thing. So Mrs. D, aged 81, had Alzheimer's disease, and she was discovered in her long-term care room with her blouse and bra removed. Sitting beside her on the bed was Mr. E. He was 79 years of age, and he also had Alzheimer's. Due to concerns about harm, the couple was separated, and Mr. E was closely observed as he initially thought was the pursuer. Any interactions between the two were redirected. However, Mrs. D was found in similar situations, the care team noting she often pursued male residents for intimate contact. She was referred to the team psychologist who, so she could have her sexual consent capacity assessed. So in that particular interview, it came out that she was a social butterfly, and she'd been married 4 times. And when she was asked about her wishes for a relationship, she stated, "I like to be close with someone." So during the functional capacity assessment, that's the right-hand side on the weighing scales from the previous slide, Mrs. D was unable to identify an intended partner and showed limited understanding about the types of intimate activities in which she wanted to engage. So that's the understanding piece of this, or the knowledge piece of this. And when asked about her process of deciding to engage in a sexual intimate activity, Mrs. D was able to say she liked to hold hands with a man and he kissed and be kissed, but was not able to demonstrate her decision-making process or why she wanted these things. Notably, Mrs. D was able to identify that a person has a choice whether to participate in sexual intimate activities. However, she was unable to communicate how to identify if someone did not want to engage intimately, or what she would do if she did not want to engage in sexual activityness, and that's the voluntariness. So what did they do? So they looked at all of her cognitive ability, and they decided as a team to look at the risk-benefit analysis, noting that she may not have the capacity to engage in sexual activities, but there may be ways to lessen any potential harm and still support intimacy. The recommendations that the team made were given to limit her sexual and intimate activities to those with lower potential for harm. So strategies to increase non-sexual touch into her care plan. So things like holding hands were okay, hugs were okay, but anything further than that would be stopped or redirected. So they formulated a proposed care plan and worked with their daughter to fulfill Mrs. D's unmet needs for touch with manicures and back rubs, socialization by moving her to sit with a table with co-ed groups, and social celebratory activities. As the care plan continued to evolve, Mrs. D was noted to continue to pursue male companionship and developed a non-sexual friendship with another male resident, and the team observed no further incidences. So you can see how when something like this happens, an assessment has to occur. But you also noted that they took a lot of other factors into mind when they began to develop the care plan for this particular activity. So other considerations that need to happen when you're making this care plan: the level of cognition, psychiatric and emotional factors, personal values, and risk. So when a number of years ago, I worked with a judge from New York. Her name is Evelyn Tenenbaum, and we wrote a couple of articles related to consent and sexuality when dementia is present. And she chose to use a couple of terms that are related to end-of-life decision-making and propose them for use in making decisions related to sexuality. And those are substituted judgment and best interests. Now, substituted judgment, you might remember, are cases like Karen Ann Quinlan, the person who was brain dead, and it was taken to court by her family members. One side wanted to remove her life support and the other side did not. And in court, they tried to use substituted judgment to determine whether Karen would have wanted this for herself. And because there were so few records, they finally found someone who had had a conversation with her at a party who she had said as a side comment, oh, I would never want to live as a vegetable if I had a car accident. And so that was actually the comment that was used as substituted judgment to determine what should happen to this person. Well, in the case of substituted judgment for consent to sexuality, when there's dementia present, those judgments would be based on past values. So quite typically, it's the family members that we go to for these judgments. And the family might say, my mom would never want to have an intimate relationship with someone who wasn't my dad. They were married for 80 years or whatever. I think that's a little out there. But they were married for a really long time. She was faithful to him throughout all that time, and she went to church every Sunday. And so they are saying that her values would be that she would be embarrassed to have this particular relationship. The flip side is best interest, and best interest takes into consideration a cost and benefits analysis in determining what is best and least harmful for the persons involved. And so many times, if you don't have a substituted judgment to fall back on, you use this best interest. In her first piece, Evelyn Tenenbaum had written that she thought best interest should always be followed because the person with dementia is a new person now. Their needs must be met. But then after some consideration and perhaps having seen some cases, she decided that no, family needs must also be considered. So she recommends using both substituted judgment and best interest and a village approach. So all of the key stakeholders, all of the people that care about this particular person with dementia need to be at the table making decisions about what is and is not appropriate, what will be good or won't be good for this particular person. So just briefly, I want to talk just a little bit about resident-on-resident aggression. And by that we mean incidences where we see the reports come from IJs, which means immediate jeopardy. In the state of Kansas, 2 years ago, immediate jeopardy citations went from 24 to 124. And most of those were resident-on-resident aggression. Immediate jeopardy means that there's danger or harm that might happen to either a resident or a staff member or the person who might be the perpetrator. And so in these incidents, we started looking at, well, how much of this was sexual in nature? And about half of the aggression was caused by, half of the IJs were caused by resident-on-resident aggression, and half of those, or a quarter of all the 124, was related to sexual incidences. And so we followed up on that a little bit to see what was going on there. In most instances, it seemed like the nursing homes did not have written into their care plans what their interventions were for this particular behavior. And sometimes this behavior, even though inappropriate, was seen to continue longer than it should have without changes or interventions. So these are some of the forms of inappropriate behavior that we're seeing. And of course, a lot of it happens when a person with dementia wanders into somebody else's room. Sometimes they take things that don't belong to them. Sometimes they crawl into bed. Sometimes they approach a person that they think looks a lot like their spouse. So invasion of privacy or personal space. Roommate problems. Quite frequently, rooms are assigned without thought to vetting whether personalities were matched, and that can cause a problem. Hostile interpersonal interactions. Sometimes you just get a mean person in the nursing home, and there's not much you can do about it. Unprovoked actions and inappropriate sexual behavior. So a little bit of research has been done to look into who the perpetrators are of resident-on-resident aggression, and we find that they're bullies. They have a higher level of cognitive awareness, have better physical function, and they have a history of this aggression. And again, I put a picture here of a man because typically we think of men as the ones that are the aggressors, but I'm here to tell you that there's a lot of kind of bully females in nursing homes as well. But we're also seeing that females are quite frequently the targets, and they have a higher level of cognitive impairment and lots of problems with wandering behaviors. Some of the inappropriate behavior interventions that were mentioned earlier, particularly in regards to boredom, now we're seeing some things with circadian lighting that might be something to consider as well, that might reduce the wandering behaviors and prevent people from getting into trouble in people's rooms. So this aggression is happening in communal rooms, the dining room in particular. We see it happening more often in the afternoons, that there might be some problems with communication and that lead to frustration, invasion of space, and sometimes it just happens without any provocation, which of course are by all means the hardest things for nursing home staff to try to intervene or to prevent. So what are the causes? Boredom. We see lots of bad behaviors from boredom. One of the things that isn't mentioned here, but is something to consider, is that people with dementia, older people in particular, may have been abused when they were younger. It could be sexual abuse, it could be physical abuse, it could even be psychological abuse. And when they have dementia in later years, and particularly if they've never had any sort of counseling or attention paid to those abusive problems, then they can come to light then later on in their behaviors. And so that's something that isn't often talked about. I try to always talk about it when I'm talking to new staff members for nursing homes. It's not something that's written into training programs, but the fact that many people may have been abused early on in life, and then some of those behaviors that you see in dementia may be related to that. So competition for attention, also communication difficulties and unmet needs, all of these things can lead to this aggression caused by frustration. So some pretty negative impacts from this. People are more likely to die in 12 months following the incident. They could sustain an injury. If it's sexual in nature, there could be some infection related to it, psychological, emotional, and behavioral consequences. All of these things are pretty hard to deal with. I might tell you the end of that story. IJs have gone down again to about 20 in the state of Kansas. We think part of that was a lot of education, both at the staffing level, but also at the state level with regulators to help them have a better grasp of why these things are happening. We don't know if the increase might be a change in population, that the baby boomer population now entering nursing home needs have some sort of behavioral differences or psychological differences than older generations, but it's something to keep an eye on. So what can help? Well, what we know here at the Center on Aging, having worked in person-centered care for nearly 20 years now, is that consistent assignment of staff is the most important thing. So why is that important? It means that relationships can form. So if a staff person consistently takes care of the same person who has dementia, they will understand their behaviors, understand their unmet needs, and be able to help them far better than a staff person who rotates among a home that has 75 residents. So that's the one thing that we really, really push for our person-centered care, is that you form those relationships that help people to better understand what's going on with the needs of older adults. Person-centered care takes into consideration what people actually want or desire. It seems bizarre that we didn't ever consider that for so long in long-term care, that it was regimented to be efficient for the home and really not to make life better for the people that live there. And staff training is very, very important. So resources that are needed, we need to work on training manuals. We need sexual consent policies. The first one was done about 20 years ago in New York at the Hebrew Home it's escaping me right now, but some of you online probably know about it. They've had sexuality policies in place for the longest time. And the reason that they have them, the reason it works, is not so much what's in it, but the fact that people know that they have one. So it's listed on their website. And if you don't want your mom to have an intimate relationship when she's in the nursing home, you probably wouldn't pick that place because they honor people's sexual expression needs. And so if you have a policy that you recognize that residents have needs for sexual expression, then you probably won't have the troubles that a lot of other places that don't have these in policy have. So there's lots of resources. I want to tell you that many of us believe that without intimacy and the ability to express our sexuality, we lack the buffer to survive the losses that are associated with aging. So if everything else is taken away from us, shouldn't we still continue to have sexual relationships and intimacy in our life if it's possible? So that concludes my talk. This is a picture of the book that I wrote. It's still in print. I wrote it about 5 years ago. You can get it on Amazon. And if you work with staff in a nursing home, I recommend that you mention it to them because it has a very, very strong person-centered approach that it would be good with anybody who has dementia. And here's some of the Alzheimer's Association support.
Thank you. So this is some of the Alzheimer's Foundation of America, some of our information, but we do have time for questions and comments or concerns. So now is your time. Again, please go to the right-hand side on the panel, and you will see a place where you could type in your questions under questions. So we have a question from Stephanie, and she wants to know exactly what your book is called. Maybe go back to the slide that shows your book.
Yeah, it's Sexuality in Long-Term Care, and I don't remember what the colon says, but you can find it if you go to Amazon by typing in Sexuality in Long-Term Care by Gail Apple Dole.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Are you aware of any nursing home residents that have had to be arrested because of this?
No, I am not aware, and I doubt that would happen, particularly if it was somebody with dementia. I think what would happen would be they would go for a psych unit to be assessed there, and a determination would be made about a proper placement for that person. But it wouldn't be beyond my belief that a person could get arrested for doing something bad enough.
Okay, thank you.
Somebody online might have more information related to that.
Great, thank you. So we have another question. How do I address sexuality with the caregiver, the caregiver who's not living with dementia, who doesn't live in a long-term care?
So let me see if I can understand this. The caregiver is working with a person who doesn't have dementia?
That's what I understand. It sounds like the client in the setting is living with dementia, but the care partner, yes, I'm working with the family member. Mm-hmm.
And the family member has dementia, but the care partner does not?
Yes.
Okay, so, and what you're asking is the family member is wanting to discuss sexuality with the caregiver, and they want to know how to approach that. That's what I
understand.
Okay, so this is a story that's kind of related to it, and then maybe I can evolve what I'm thinking. But I had a friend who had 24-hour care for her parents at their home, and a problem arose because her father was viewing pornography on a computer, and she asked me what to do, and I said, well, just tell your dad to close the door, because and that was the advice I gave to my brother, who once asked about his son watching pornography. I said, just make more noise before you go into his room, because it was a normal pattern with her father, something that he'd done throughout his life, and he did have dementia, and he wasn't being aggressive with the staff or anything. So the daughter had to be pretty assertive and go to the staff and say, this is something my dad's done for a long time. As long as he's not hurting you, being an aggressor, you close the door and let him continue with it. I think it's just a lot of effort to enlighten people to say if it's something that is not hurting anybody, then it should be permitted because obviously it's a benefit to someone. If there's behaviors that are inappropriate, then I think you're going to have a much more detailed conversation about the reason this is happening and interventions that could be substituted.
Thank you. How do I find out the sexual laws for each state? Need to help make policies for our company. I am Connecticut, looking to get help.
I don't think they're too difficult to find. I think just a Google search will take you to them. When I was preparing this particular presentation for an earlier audience, I went to Informed Consent for Sexuality for the state of Kansas. It will be a broad statement and for all age groups, not just people who are older, not just people who have dementia. It's never been, I don't think any of these policies are stated in specific terms like that.
Okay, I have another question. There are times when a resident wants to have a closeness with another resident, but the family insists that it's not like my mom or dad and is adamant against it. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, we see that quite a bit. And going back to the reference I made to the nursing home at Hebrew Home at Riverdale, they've actually created a video that is appropriate for this. And they interviewed a couple of family members. In one instance, a couple of people with dementia in the nursing home became attracted to each other, and the family members were very supportive. You may remember that this also happened with Sandra Day O'Connor, whose husband was in assisted living and fell in love with a resident there, and she was very supportive of it because it improved his quality of life. So there's a lot of things that have to happen in that case. It's a very sensitive issue because what we find is that the nursing homes create policies for family members more than they do for residents. So if the family members don't want this interaction to happen, then to avoid problems with the state, that's probably what's going to happen, is you will separate the two residents. But a sensitivity training, sexuality training for the family members is also important. It's something I've addressed in my book, and it's something that you need to address when you talk about training within your nursing home.
Thank you. Do you have any resources for a spouse who does not want her husband with dementia to have any physical contact? For example, no hugs due to him having some sexual expressions.
Yeah, well, the same response as the previous one. A lot of education has to happen. It might be a good idea in that particular case, to form a support network for spouses within the nursing home so that they can talk about similar issues. Perhaps if she talks to a peer, another wife who has a husband that is in a similar situation, it might help her to better understand that everybody needs to be touched in some form or another. If he has problematic behavior, then the reasons for that need to be addressed as well. If she could see that he wasn't being sexual every time somebody touched him or hugged him, then she might change her tune.
Thank you. The men at my facility want to have gatherings to have a private screening of X-rated movies. What are your thoughts?
I love it. I don't know if you all remember, but there was a case a few years ago of a woman. Her picture got into Facebook because she had dementia. She was in a nursing home. They brought in a stripper, and she was putting money in his G-string. And the son, I think, actually sued the nursing home, or was threatening to, until he found out that his wife, the daughter-in-law, signed the mother-in-law up for this event. So I think it's similar to, I thought that I had gone to a sexual toy party not long ago, and it was a riot. It was so fun. And I thought, well, we should be doing these on in retirement communities. And the thing is, you have to be pretty sensitive to the fact that people are not going to like it. Some people are not going to like it. So it has to be by invitation only, or it has to make sure that you have signed approval from family members. But if for people who are not cognitively impaired, they should have the same things that they would have living in community if they're living in nursing home. And if we're not offering them things like that, then they're not getting the same quality of life that other people living outside of the community are getting.
Thank you.
Great question. I love it.
Oh, good. I know it's 2 o'clock. How many more moments do we have? Is it okay if we answer a couple more questions?
Sure, I'm fine.
Okay. How do you feel about handing out condoms at a facility?
Well, we didn't talk about STIs at all, but obviously that is seen as a rising issue. I don't know that we're seeing that much in nursing homes, but I would not just hand out condoms. I would do it as a piece of education. So I think that people are interested in having education about the sexual changes as they get older. I think people are interested in maintaining intimate relationships, if at all possible. Now, we're talking about nursing homes here, and there's not much sexual intercourse going on in nursing homes because, frankly, most people really can't manage it because nursing homes today now take a much higher acuity level. But assisted livings and retirement communities, absolutely yes. You should be handing out condoms, but not without providing education at the same time.
Thank you. That actually finishes our questions. So we will be winding down. I do want to thank you so much for today's presentation. I learned information, and just based on the questions, this is information that people are excited to learn about and implement, hopefully, in their settings moving forward. I want to thank you for such a wonderful presentation yet again, and I hope everyone joins us again next month for our next presentation. I hope everyone has a good rest of the day, and we're happy that you always join us on our free webinar, Care Connection. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a good day. Thank you. Bye-bye.